Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. On today's episode, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar will join me to discuss the latest developments from this week. We'll touch upon a host of different topics, including the tensions between India and Pakistan, Russia's Wikchi Day celebrations, and the war in Gaza. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan welcomed Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani at the presidential complex in Ankara on Thursday. During the high-level talks, the two leaders reaffirmed their shared commitment to enhancing bilateral ties.
Kalkınma Yolu projesi hem Irak'ın hem de tüm bölgemizin istikrarına ve refahına büyük katkı sağlayacaktır. Görüşmemizde projenin hızla hayata geçirilmesine yönelik adımları ele aldık. Kalkınma yoluna ilgi duyan tüm ülkeleri bu stratejik projenin parçası olmaya davet ediyoruz.
The Turkish leader expressed appreciation for the Iraqi government's sensitivity toward protecting the rights and interests of the Turkmen community.
Kardeşim Sudani'nin, Irak Türkmenlerinin hak ve menfaatlerinin korunması konusundaki hassasiyetini takdirle karşılıyorum. Heyetinde Irak Türkmen Cephesi Başkanı kardeşime de yer vermesini özellikle anlamlı buluyorum. Rabbim Türkiye-Irak kardeşliğini daim ve kaim eylesin diyorum.
The two leaders also reaffirmed their joint resolve to combat terrorism, identifying it as a common threat to the security of both countries.
Türkiye'nin olduğu kadar Irak'ın milli güvenliğine de tehdit oluşturan PKK, FETÖ ve DAEŞ'e karşı müşterek mücadelenin sürdürülmesi konusunda kararlılığımızı teyit ettik. Bölgemizin geleceğinde teröre yer olmadığının tekrar altını çizdik.
The Iraqi Prime Minister's visit is seen as a further step in solidifying Ankara-Baghdad cooperation amid growing regional and economic integration efforts.
Derin tarihi, beşeri ve kültürel bağlara sahip olduğumuz Irak'la ilişkilerimizi salt iki devlet arasındaki münasebetler olarak görmüyoruz. İşbirliğimizin her alanda geliştirilmesini, kardeşlik hukukumuzun bir gereği olarak telakki ediyoruz. Irak'ın huzuru ve istikrarını hiçbir zaman ülkemizden ayrı tutmadık, tutmuyoruz.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program as well.
Good morning, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start our discussions for today with the relations between Turkey and Iraq. The Iraqi Prime Minister Shia al-Sudani was in Ankara yesterday where he met President Erdoğan. They held discussions on many different things, infrastructure projects, terrorism, bilateral ties. Tell me more about this, Mustafa. What was discussed in detail between the two sides?
Omar, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan welcomed Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani to the presidential complex in the capital of Ankara, and both the Turkish and Iraqi decision makers discussed bilateral relationships between Turkey and Iraq, and they also exchanged views on the latest security challenges in the Middle East. And President Erdoğan and Iraqi Premier also saw the signing of several agreements between Turkish and Iraqi policy makers in terms of deepening the bilateral relationships between two neighbors in the Middle East. And following the signing ceremony, both Erdoğan and al-Sudani addressed the journalists to discuss what can be done in terms of strengthening the bilateral relationships between Turkey and Iraq. Within this context, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan praised Iraqi government's efforts to strengthen its cooperation with Turkey in terms of addressing the common security challenges in the region. President Erdoğan also called for further cooperation with Iraq to deal with the security challenges in the Middle East. Turkey also praised Syria's, Iraq's role in terms of preserving the political stability in Syria. Turkey claims that if regional stakeholders want to bring long-lasting peace and stability to the region, they are supposed to collaborate in the Middle East because Middle East's stability is very important and key in terms of upholding the peace and stability, both Iraq and Syria and Turkey. Within this context, I think Turkey is determined right now to strengthen its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with both Iraq and Syria in terms of upholding the long-standing peace and tranquility in the Middle East.
Mustafa, he also mentioned to Erdogan, they both discussed the role of Netanyahu in the region. Now, we've all seen Netanyahu's terrorist and genocidal policies in Palestine, but there's also the issue of the PKK. So two things. What was discussed about the Israeli policies, which are fueling unrest in the region? And secondly, tell me about the plans to fight the PKK terrorism in northern Iraq.
Omar, first of all, Turkey is always accusing Israel of endangering the peace and stability in the Middle East. As you know, Israel right now is conducting ethnic cleansing policies in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip, and Israeli security forces are also taking aim at the Palestinians living in the West Bank region. On the other hand, they are also conducting military operations in Lebanon. They are also targeting military infrastructure in Syria. They are also threatening to use power against Yemen and Iran. Within this context, right now, I think Israel wants to be only a regional hegemon in the Middle East, and Turkey is always calling for cooperation among regional stakeholders to resist against Israel's expansionist policies. Within this context, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan also slammed Israeli policies in the Middle East. Turkey is looking for more cooperation with Iraq and Syria to deal with the Israeli issue in the region. On the other hand, as you know, PKK terrorist organization were using the Iraqi territory to launch attacks against Turkey. Within this context, since the very beginning of the crisis, Turkey has been calling for more security and military cooperation with Iraq to deal with the PKK problem, because Turkey is claiming that PKK is not only posing a huge threat to Turkey's national security or territorial integrity, but also they are also targeting Iraq's political stability and economic prosperity. And in recent times, yes, Iraq has taken steps against the PKK terrorist group. But right now, Iraq is not officially recognizing PKK as a terrorist organization. They declared PKK banned organization within Iraq, and Turkey is always calling for concrete steps from Iraq to deal with the common security problem in the Middle East. As you know, this year, Turkey took a step, Terror-Free Turkey initiative, and it means that Turkey is calling upon the PKK terrorist group to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. I think Turkey's terror-free initiative also means that terror-free Middle East region. Within this context, both Syria and Iraq, I think, should increase their cooperation with Turkey in terms of military and security if they want to ensure their country's peace and stability, because, as I said, PKK is posing a huge threat to both Syria's and Iraq's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. I hope in the coming future, PKK will dissolve itself and lay their weapons, and Turkey, Iraq, and Syria will be able to strengthen their bilateral and multilateral cooperation in terms of bringing long-lasting peace and stability to the Middle East.
Mustafa, you just mentioned about Syria. Let's talk about Syria. the threat of terrorism exists in Syria as well. YPG, that was the Syrian offshoot of the PKK. Its presence, we do not know if it's still, if it's going to exist, but the actions that the Turkish military and the Turkish government have taken have shown us that terrorism can be wiped out. And like Erdoğan says, President Erdoğan says that terrorism, the PKK terrorism, needs to be removed from the root. And that's what they did through the operations in northern Iraq and northern Syria over the past few years. But this week, Syria's President, Ahmed al-Shara, he was in Paris to meet French President Emmanuel Macron. What was on the agenda? There were many things. Firstly, there were the sanctions that Syria wants the Western countries to remove. Then there was stability, regional stability and stability inside Syria as well, because over the past few weeks we saw that there were, different groups which were showing an uprising against the new Syrian government. So obviously these things exist, but what else was on the agenda when al-Shara was in Paris to meet Emmanuel Macron?
Umar, geopolitical landscape totally changed in Syria in December. As you know, the country's long-time ruler, Assad regime, collapsed in Syria as the opposition forces led by Ahmed al-Shara took control of the country, and new geopolitical situation began in Syria. Within this context, since the very beginning of the new era in Syria, Turkey has been taking steps to normalize the situation in Syria. Turkey is always calling for more cooperation with new rulers in Syria to ensure long-standing peace and stability in the war-torn Middle Eastern country. Turkey is always reiterating its strong support for Syria's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Syria's new rulers reached an agreement with PKK terrorist group Syrian offshoot PYD-YPG in March. As you know, the United States is supporting PKK terrorist organization Syrian branch PYD-YPG under the pretext of fight against Daesh. And the United States called them SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, to hide their support for the internationally recognized PKK terrorist group. I hope right now Syrian government is taking steps to normalize the geopolitical situation in the northern part of country, and diplomatic sources on the ground are informing us that Syrian security forces are taking control of the zones controlled by PYD-YPG dominated SDF. And as you say, Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara paid an official visit to France this week to meet with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. It was the first time for new Syrian rulers to visit the European country. He paid an official visit to Turkey and other Arab states, but right now it is the first time for Ahmed al-Shara to visit the European country. And Macron and al-Shara discussed bilateral relations with France and Syria. They also exchanged views on the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. And for Syrian government, the most important thing is right now is the lifting of sanctions imposed by Western countries on Syria, because during the Assad regime, many Western countries, including France, were imposing sanctions on Syria, because they were accusing the Assad regime of using brutal forces against the Syrian people. And right now, Syrian government claims that the geopolitical situation changed in Syria, and the Western countries will be supposed to lift their sanctions on Syria, because Syria right now desperately needs international investment to totally reconstruct and rebuild the country. I think right now some Western countries, including the United States and France, are taking steps to lift some sanctions on Syria, and I think it will yield positive results in terms of rebuilding and reconstructing Syria's economic and political infrastructure.
Musa, there are two important things that I want to remind our audiences. Macron has said that he will push the European Union to let sanctions on Syria expire when they come up for renewal, like you just said, on June 1. He is going to press his European allies to ensure that those sanctions will be removed on Syria. And then Macron has also pledged that he will ask the United States to remove its troops from Syria. But I want to also touch upon one last thing. The World Bank says the reconstruction of Syria would take $250 billion, and Turkey has also voiced support for Syria's reconstruction. Just very briefly, tell me, how is Turkey looking at the reconstruction of the war-torn country?
Umar, as you know, right now, Turkey is hosting more than 3 million Syrian refugees. And Turkey claims that if Syria rebuilds and reconstructs the country, Syrians will return to their homeland with dignified and voluntary situation. Within this context, Turkish ministers are regularly paying an official visit to Syria to discuss what can be done in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in the Middle Eastern country. As you know, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan hosted Syria's new interim president Ahmet El-Shara in Turkey twice. They also discuss bilateral relationships between Turkey and Syria, and Turkey is always calling for international cooperation to rebuild and reconstruct Syria. It is not up to only Turkey, it is up to all international community if they want to peace and stability in the Middle Eastern region and Syria. Within this context, Turkey is trying to increase international awareness about the new geopolitical landscape in Syria. Turkey is calling upon its Western allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to engage more talks with new rulers in Syria in terms of upholding the peace and stability in the country. Within this context, I think in the coming future, Turkey will invest in Syria's infrastructure to rebuild the country and to ensure peace and stability in the region, because, as I said, now Syrian people want to return to their homeland, but they also seek assurances from new government in terms of ensuring their survival. And if Syria rebuilds and reconstructs itself, I think it will raise hope among Syrians in terms of returning to their homeland.
As we all know, tensions between India and Pakistan have been rising quickly over the last few days. Let's take a look at what Turkey has to say on the situation.
In a phone conversation, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan expressed Turkey's commitment to taking all necessary steps to prevent further escalation of tensions between India and Pakistan. The discussion focused on the rising tensions between the two neighboring nations, particularly in the wake of a recent attack.
Pakistan ile Hindistan arasındaki gerilimin çok sayıda sivilin şehit olduğu füze saldırılarıyla sıcak çatışmaya dönüşmesinden endişe duyuyoruz. Saldırılarda hayatını kaybeden kardeşlerimize Allah'tan rahmet, kardeş Pakistan halkına ve devletine bir kez daha başsağlığı diliyorum.
Erdoğan reaffirmed Turkey's support for Pakistan, emphasizing the importance of a calm and measured response to the situation. In turn, Prime Minister Sharif expressed his gratitude for Turkey's solidarity and support, noting that Pakistan deeply appreciated the Turkish efforts aimed at de-escalation and maintaining peace in South Asia. The phone call reflects Turkey's continued efforts to mediate and promote stability in the region, as tensions between India and Pakistan continue to remain high.
Cammu Keşmir'deki menfur terör saldırısına ilişkin Pakistan'ın uluslararası soruşturma yürütülmesi teklifini kıymetli buluyoruz. Türkiye olarak ateşe benzin dökenlerin olmasına rağmen biz olaylar geri dönülmez noktaya varmadan tansiyonun düşürülmesi, diyalog kanallarının açılması için her türlü gayreti gösteriyoruz.
Welcome back to the program. Let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Musa, there are some interesting stories. Let's begin with the first one about India and Pakistan. Now, India has attacked multiple cities again in Pakistan. The cities of Karachi, Lahore and Rawalpindi were attacked last night. What has been the Pakistani response?
Well, right now, geopolitical tensions are rapidly escalating between two nuclear arch-rivals in the Southeast Asia region. Pakistan claims that it shot down dozens of Indian drones violating the Pakistani airspace. As you know, 2 weeks ago, some gunmen carried out deadly strikes against tourists in Indian-administered Kashmir. And since then, warmongers in India have been pressuring the Modi government to launch attacks against Pakistan. And India is blaming Pakistan for being behind this attack in the Indian-administered Kashmir region. Pakistan has strongly denied accusations held by the Indian decision makers. And this week, India also launched airstrikes against civilian infrastructure in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And since the very beginning of the crisis between India and Pakistan, Turkish decision makers, particularly President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, are in touch with Pakistani decision makers in terms of the de-escalating the situation in the region. Turkey, yes, is always supporting Pakistan's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. But on the other hand, Turkey is also enjoying close relationships with India. And within this context and based on its bilateral relationships with both India and Pakistan, Turkey is always calling for dialogue and diplomacy between two important neighbors in the region to de-escalate the situation. Turkey is warning against the all-out of war between Pakistan and India, because as you know, both Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons. And if situation escalates furthermore, maybe some of these countries will be supposed to use nuclear weapons. And using of nuclear weapons, I think, will not only put risk for India and Pakistan, this situation, but also I think will put international peace and stability at risk. And I hope both India and Pakistan should take Turkey's demands into the consideration, and they will de-escalate the situation. In this period, I think Turkey can play an important role between Pakistan and India. Turkey can be a mediator or facilitator to initiate peace talks between India and Pakistan. And I think both sides will find a common way and a common sense. Then the situation will be de-escalated in the region.
Musa, let's talk about this one. Turkish Defense Ministry sources have said that Israeli attacks are disrupting stability in Syria. Tell me more about that.
Omar, since December, as you know, Israeli security forces have been launching air strikes against civilian or military infrastructure in Syria. And since the very beginning of the crisis, Turkey has been warning against Israel's provocative military actions in Syria. Yes, Turkish decision makers reiterate at every opportunity that Turkey does not seek any military cooperation with Israel over the Syrian territory. But I think right now Israeli decision makers think that there is a geopolitical vacuum in Syria, and they feel that they are supposed to fulfill this so-called geopolitical vacuum in the war-torn country. And Turkey is always accusing Israel of disrupting peace and stability in the Middle East. As you know, Netanyahu last month visited the United States to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump, and he called on Trump to increase pressure on Turkey, because as we know that Turkey's growing geopolitical influence in Syria is pushing Israel's buttons. And Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is seeking United States help in terms of de-escalating the geopolitical situation in Syria right now, because Trump clearly sided with Turkey and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan in front of the international media, and he claims that Israel should be reasonable if they want to see peace and stability in the region. Azerbaijan right now is hosting informal talks between Turkish and Israeli decision makers to de-escalate the tensions between two important countries in the Middle East. I hope Israel will be able to withdraw its security forces from Syria, and Syria will reclaim its all sovereignty in the country.
Indeed, those comments made by Trump when he was meeting Netanyahu were in favor of President Erdogan and the Turkish government and the decisions that they have taken. Now, Musa, some other interesting stories. Let's take a look. Global warming has always been a concern. Well, these 10% responsible for 2/3 of global warming. That's another study, a very important story. Then also I want to touch upon this one, Mustafa. Turkish Technic and Rolls-Royce to launch leading engine maintenance site. Now, Turkish Technic is basically the arm of Turkish Airlines, which is responsible for engine maintenance. Now, they have signed a deal, and this project is going to be launched at the new Istanbul airport. It's not expected to begin anytime soon. It's the date they've given is 2036. Still a long time, but still a very interesting development. Then economic ties with UK gradually strengthening. This is what the Turkish Trade Minister has said, Omar Bolat. He has said that ties are increasing in terms of the economy. Mustafa, the last one that I want to touch upon is Turkey-Iraq ties to serve as pillar of regional stability. We discussed this before as well. What's the story talking about?
Umar, Turkey and Iraq have been enjoying close relationships in all fields, ranging from politics and economy and to trade and regional stability in the Middle East. Turkish decision makers are always calling for more cooperation with Iraq in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East. And yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan praised Iraq's role in the region to uphold security and tranquility. Within this context, I think Turkey is also developing a new project with Iraq to bring a long-standing peace and economic prosperity to the region. The development and road project, I think, will also include many other countries from the region or outside of the region. And Turkey is always asking more cooperation with regional stakeholders in the Middle East in terms of ensuring economic prosperity and political stability in the Middle East region, because Turkey claims that if regional stakeholders, particularly Turkey and Iraq, cooperate with each other, it will help all regional stakeholders reach peace and tranquility in the Middle East. And yesterday, Iraq's Prime Minister's visit to Turkey, I think, was one of the most important steps between Turkey and Iraq to ensure peace and stability in the region.
Musa, some final words from Daily Sabah. There's a match between Fenerbahce, Başakşehir, the top headlines. Turkey, Dubai open new era in travel trends. We've seen the ties increasing between Turkey and the UAE. We also know about the situation in Sudan. There's also a small note about the houses or the homes or the buildings, residential structures that are risky in Istanbul. Now we're going to take a look at this news report, and when we come back, we'll have more to discuss.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone conversation with his American counterpart Donald Trump on Monday. Two leaders addressed a wide range of regional and global issues, including the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, Turkey-US ties, and the situation in Syria. Erdoğan emphasized Turkey's commitment to deepening cooperation with the United States, particularly in the defense industry. He also expressed support for Trump's approach to ending global conflicts, voicing appreciation for efforts to sustain dialogue with Iran and to help end the war between Russia and Ukraine. Touching on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, President Erdoğan said the situation had reached alarming levels and stressed the urgency of delivering uninterrupted aid. He affirmed that Turkey is ready to provide all necessary support to establish a ceasefire and achieve lasting peace in the region. On Syria, Erdoğan reiterated Turkey's dedication to preserving Syria's territorial integrity and ensuring long-term stability. He welcomed U.S. initiatives to ease sanctions on Syria, saying such steps could contribute positively to peace efforts in the region and beyond. Erdoğan also extended an invitation to Trump to visit Turkey. In return, Trump confirmed in a social media post that the call was productive and said he looked forward to welcoming the Turkish leader in Washington. The conversation marked a continuation of Erdoğan's diplomatic outreach to promote ceasefires and regional cooperation amid intensifying global tensions.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Mustafa, as we were watching Erdoğan-Trump, their relationship over the past few years has been excellent. But there are many issues as well. There's F-35, there's F-16, there's support for terror groups in Syria. Now, how are you looking at this relationship right now?
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone conversation with his American counterpart Donald Trump this week to discuss bilateral relationships between two important NATO allies and exchange views on the regional and international security developments. As you know, Turkey and the United States are two important NATO members, but there are also many challenges poisoning the bilateral relationships between Ankara and Washington. And one of the problems is that United States' ongoing support for the PKK terrorist organizations, Syrian offshoot, PYD, YPG. I think if we want to understand the current cooperation between the United States and PKK, I think we have to delve into the origins of the problems. During the civil war years in Syria, the United States was looking for proxy forces on the ground to eliminate Daesh terror groups. And American decision makers engaged high-level security and military talks with PYD, YPG in northern Syria, and they used PYD, YPG terrorists as proxy forces to eradicate the Daesh terror threat. But on the other hand, Turkey is always reiterating that one terror group cannot be defeated by using another one. As you know, Turkey also conducted its own military operation against the Daesh in northern Syria in 2016, and Turkey was able to destroy the Daesh terror threat in the region. But following that development, the United States continued to give its strong support for the PYD, YPG terrorists in the region. And these topics are poisoning the bilateral relationships between two important NATO allies. Then Turkey is always calling for concrete steps from the United States in terms of cutting its relationships with the terrorist groups in northern Syria. On the other hand, as you also mentioned, that there is also F-35 fighter jets issue between Turkey and the United States. As you know, Turkey was looking for air defense systems from its Western allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization during the civil war years in Syria. Except Spain, some important allies within the NATO turned a blind eye to Turkey's security demands. And Turkey looked another options to increase defense capabilities against security threats coming from the northern Syria. And Turkey reached an agreement with Russia to acquire Russia's advanced S-400 air defense systems. But since then, the United States has been claiming that Turkey is cooperating with our adversary, because there is CAATSA in the United States. And CAATSA means countering the American adversaries through Sanctions Act. And thanks to CAATSA process in the United States, the American decision makers imposed sanctions on Turkey's national defense industry, and they also expelled Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter jets program. As you know, Turkey is one of the most important contributors to F-35 fighter jets program. And right now, both Erdoğan and Trump, as you know, are enjoying close bilateral ties. Trump is always calling the Turkish leader smart guy and tough politician in the international diplomacy. And they also discussed during their phone conversation this week about the F-35 stealth fighter jet program. Turkey is also, looking for the modernizing of its F-16 fleet. And within this context, I think both Turkey and the United States will be able to take steps in terms of strengthening bilateral cooperation between two NATO allies in terms of addressing common security challenges in the region.
Mustafa, a very interesting event is taking place in Russia today. Russia is marking Victory Day, Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, which was also known as the Great Patriotic War in Russia. Now, we know the Russia-Ukraine war is also ongoing. It's been 3 years. This is the 4th year of the war in Ukraine. Many world leaders like Nicolas Maduro, Chinese President Xi Jinping are in attendance today in Moscow. Is Moscow again flexing its military might? What is it going to do? European Union leaders, leaders, I should say, and American leaders are not happy with what's going on in Russia. Tell me more about the situation, Mustafa. Where do we stand in the war in Ukraine?
Omar, as you know, since Donald Trump took office at the White House in January, the United States has been pushing for peace and ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. But some steps taken by the United States and the Trump administration are fearing concerns among the NATO allies in the Europe continent. Some European nations are accusing the United States of excluding Ukraine from the peace talks, because, as you know, United States is also in talks with Russia in terms of normalizing their bilateral relationships. Saudi Arabia and Turkey hosted talks between the American and Russian decision makers. Also, United States engaged high-level talks with Russia in terms of reach a ceasefire in the Eastern Europe to put an end to the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. But right now, U.S. President Trump is also expressing his frustration over both the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian leader Vladimir Putin. And the United States right now is threatening to withdraw its support for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. On the other hand, both Ukraine and Russia are also trying to convince the Trump administration because they claim that Ukrainians are claiming that Russia is obstructing the peace talks. On the other hand, Russia is claiming that Ukraine is preventing any ceasefire deal. And within this context, United States is expressing its frustration over both Ukraine and Russia's approach to possible truce deals. And Turkey is also calling for peace and stability in the Eastern Europe. As you know, Turkey is enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia. Turkey is reiterating at every opportunity that there will be no winners in war, and there will be no losers in peace. Within this context, Turkey is always praising the United States' approach towards the Ukraine-Russia war. This week, Erdoğan, during his phone conversation with Trump, also praised the United States' support for peace and diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia. But actually, I don't think that Russia and Ukraine will reach a long-standing ceasefire, because right now there are many complex issues between two warring sides to deal with. And as you know, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and no one from the Western countries, including Turkey, is recognizing the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. But some diplomatic sources right now are claiming that Trump is willing to recognize Crimea's annexation by Russia in terms of paving the way for more ceasefire talks between two warring sides. But Ukraine is totally against it. I think given the geopolitical situation on the ground right now, I don't think that Ukraine and Russia will reach a ceasefire and long-standing peace and stability in the Eastern Europe.
Not to forget, President Trump called Zelensky a dictator at the Pope's funeral as well. Mustafa, before we end the program, just let me remind our audiences about the situation in Gaza as well, because that's a very important topic. Nearly 52,000 people have been killed now in the occupied Gaza Strip. The Israeli army has also approved a new plan to take full control of Gaza and displace the Palestinians. The international reaction has not been harsh like it should have been. But the international community is pressing Israel to ensure that they do not do that and Palestinians get the right to stay in their own territory. Mustafa Koja Kinar, thank you so much for being on the program today as well.
You are welcome, Omar.
And that wraps up this edition of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with more insights.